Okay, so hello and welcome back. Now we made our way to basically to class 2 chapter 6, and here basically we have a chapter which is pretty important. There is a whole bunch of material here and we need to essentially understand it. So here we have essentially a bunch of people that have some flowers, and this is essentially decoration for celebration. And basically we have essentially, for example, this person Javid, for example, or essentially Akash, for example. You see that he has 1, 2, 3, 4, basically four groups of 10, and meaning that he has essentially all of these flowers. Essentially what he's done is that he has grouped essentially all of his flowers into groups of 10, and he's gotten now basically 4 groups of 10, and then he's got essentially 8 loose ones, which means that basically he has 48 flowers essentially in total, right? Now we have used essentially these numbers this way so far, but we have never actually discussed why we write our numbers the way that we write them, right? Meaning that, for example, if Rohan, suppose that Rohan basically has I don't know, 12, for example, flowers, or 12 marbles, for example. So you have essentially your 12 marbles over here: 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12, right? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12. That's basically 12 marbles. Now we write our number this way, meaning that for a 12 we write a 1 and a 2. But why is that? Now the reason why we write our numbers this way is that because of the fact that essentially, as we saw, for the sake of simplicity and ease of counting, we can essentially group our objects into basically groups of 10, and then you don't have to keep counting things over and over again. Meaning that essentially these objects, I can essentially take these marbles, these 10 marbles, I can keep them over here as a group of 10. So that's a group of 10, and then I have 2 loose ones, okay? So then essentially I know that essentially a 10 and a 2 is a 12, and basically a 12 we write it this way, right? Now why is that we write the number this way? The reason is that basically that you have essentially one group of 10. So in this number essentially you have essentially one group of 10, and essentially these are, you can think of these loose ones as essentially groups of 1. So over here I have 2 groups of 1, and basically 1 group of 10, right? Now what I can do now, back then when there was no number system, there was nothing, people used to essentially keep track of things using a system that was essentially like these, for example, using small sticks, or essentially using these using essentially a small, basically a small line, and when they wanted to essentially to write a 5, essentially to write a 1, they would write it this way. To write a 2, they would write it essentially, they would use 2 of these sticks. To write a 3, they would write it essentially this way. To write a 4, they would write it this way. So this was a 1, this was a 2, this was a 3, this was a 4, and then a 5 would be essentially a 4, and then a line something like this, a slanted line like this, that would be 5. And then you could essentially put these together, meaning that, for example, for a 25, or essentially for a 25, you needed a 10, you needed a 20. So for 4 of these groups, basically 1 group, 2 groups, 3 groups, 4 groups, that's essentially a 20, or essentially 24. And then 4 of these loose ones, that would be essentially, this whole thing essentially would be a 24, right? Still there was still no characters. Essentially these characters for the numbers, still we didn't have them, and then we didn't have a system in order to essentially to put these characters together to make numbers. But today essentially what we have is a number system. This number system essentially has 2 very important and useful properties and characteristics. One property of this number system is that we have essentially all of these digits or characters that we can use in the number system, meaning that we have essentially 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So that's essentially 10 characters that we can use in our number system. But still you need to have essentially a system that using which you can essentially put these things together, meaning that, for example, when you want to write a 12, you would write it this way. When you write this, when you write this, it becomes 120. When you write it this, essentially it becomes a 1200, and when you write this, it becomes essentially 12,000. More or less, essentially, we have used the same characters, but essentially by adding zeros in front of the number, we can considerably change the value of the number, meaning that essentially 1 2, a 1 2 0, 1 2 double 0, 1 2 triple 0. That's a 120, a 1200, and a 12,000, right? So basically what happens here is that the number system that we have today is called the decimal number system. It's called the decimal number system, and decimal means essentially related to 10. And then for the exact same reason, essentially we have these only 10 characters or digits basically to represent every character that you can use in the number system, right? And also the decimal number system is a place value number system. There are other number systems, place value number system. There are other number systems like for example the Roman number system. That essentially in the Roman number system there is no place value, meaning that it's more or less still the same system that we had over here, essentially using those sticks. You have to put sticks on essentially one after the other in order to make the number, meaning that, for example, in order to now in the Roman number system there is still a couple of characters, meaning that there is essentially this character which essentially stands for a 1. The value of this is 1. And then you have essentially this character, the value of which is a 5. You have this character, the value of which is a 10. You have this character, the value of which is a 50, if I'm not mistaken. And then there is another character, a C, D, and M. The value of C is essentially, this is 100, and then the D is basically a 500, and the M is a 1000. So that means that essentially now this is essentially 3, 6, and 7. 3, 6, and 7. So that's 1, 5, 10, 50, and then 100, 500, and 1,000, right? So then in this number system, essentially what you want to do, what essentially the way that you write your numbers, if you want to write a 1, you would write a 1 like this, the I. If you want to write a 2, you would put 2 of these together. If you want to write a 3, you would put 3 of these together. If you want to write a 4, you would expect that you would put essentially 4 of these together, but that's not the case. Instead of writing, and then when you want to write a 5, you would write essentially one of these characters, the V, and then when you want to write a 4, then what you will do is that you would essentially put a 5 and then subtract 1 from it. So that becomes essentially a 4. And then basically, if you want to, for example, write a 6, then you would write a 5 and then add 1 to it like this, and so on and so forth. And then, for example, if you want to write for example, a 2000, to write, for example, 1,000, you would essentially write one of these M's over here. If you want to write a 2,000, you would write essentially 2 of these M's, one after the other. And if you want to write, for example, a 2,000, for example, 200, then you would write essentially 2,000, and then 200 would be essentially 2 of these C's. You have to put them this way together, right? So you can imagine that essentially for writing large numbers, essentially this system is not efficient in any way. That's just a very cumbersome system. You cannot use it for, you cannot really use it in mathematics, for example, the way that mathematics if you use it then it would be a whole lot of trouble actually using the system, right? The decimal number system that we have is a very efficient system, and it's efficient because of the fact that, for example, when you write a 1 and a 2, the value of this is a 12, right? Now the exact same characters, if I write them and if I put a 0 over here, the value of the number becomes 120, right? So what that means is that this number system is a place value number system. And a place value number system, what that means is that essentially you have this place value over here, another place value over here, another place value over here, another place value over here, and so on and so forth. You can just simply keep going. And then every one of these, every one of these places has a value of itself, meaning that this place has a value of 1. This is the ones column. This is a value of 10. This is a value of 100. This over here is has a value of 1,000, which means that essentially when you put any digit over here, when you put essentially a digit over here, because the place value is 10 here, then basically that digit is multiplied by that place value, and automatically the value of the number is decided based on that, meaning that 1 times a 10, that's basically a 10, and then I have a 2 over here, but then the place value over here is a 1, so that's 2 times a 1, which is a 2, so then 10 plus a 2 is equal to a 12 basically. But then again, essentially, for example, for this number, this is essentially the 1's place value, this is the 10's place value, and this over here is the 100's place value. And so of course this 0 over here has although it's in the 1's place value, but because it's a 0, that means I have 0 groups of 1. So that would be simply a 0. This means I have 2 groups of 10. So that's basically a 20. And this here, this 1 over here means that I have one group of 100. That means that, and then a 20 plus 100 plus a 0 would be essentially 120. That's essentially how you write your number. That's called essentially a place value number system. Okay. So then basically when you have these when you have essentially these groups of 10 and groups of 1, so then if Simran, for example, has three groups of basically 3 groups of 10, so then you have to put a 3 in the tens place value. 3 groups of 10, you would put a 3 in the tens place value. And he has 7 groups of 1, so you put a 7 in the ones place value. And then based on that, essentially you know where to put your digits in the number, and then the value of the number becomes a 37. If Akash has essentially 4 groups of 10, you would put a 10, you would put a 4 in the tens place value, and he has essentially 8 of these ones, 8 groups of 1, and so essentially you put an 8 in the ones place value, and so you have essentially 48, right? Or for example, for this number 53, you have basically 5 groups of 10, 5 of these 10s, and then 3 of these ones, basically. That becomes a 53, right? So that is basically why we write our numbers the way that we write them, meaning that based on the place value system, you know that you have to put a 1 over here. You had basically, for example, let's say that you had 120 pebbles or 120 marbles essentially. So you keep counting your marbles, and then you come to the number 120. And of course, then you group things together, and then you know that essentially you come up with 2 groups of 10, a group of 100, and 0 groups of 1. And then based on essentially the grouping that you do, essentially you put these digits the way essentially in the right places, and that's how you actually know how to write your number, right? Now let me just give you one example here, and then we will move essentially to the next video. So suppose that I have essentially, I don't know, essentially 381 pebbles in a bag. I have 381 pebbles in a bag. Now I don't want to waste your time by essentially drawing these pebbles one after the other. So I'm just simply telling you that there is 381 pebbles in this bag. Now what I will do is that, of course, in order to know how many pebbles are in the bag, of course, let's suppose that we don't know in the beginning how many pebbles are there. So we have to start counting them. So I start counting the pebbles, and in the beginning, of course, because I know that I'm going to lose track of things, I'm going to, from the very beginning, I'm going to start to group things together as much as I can. So then I have, let's suppose that essentially this is a group of 10. So I have one group of 10. I count essentially 10 of those pebbles. I put them together in a group of 10. I make another group of 10, another group of 10, another group of 10, another group of 10, another group of 10. Let's make it 100. Let's make it 120, 121. Right? So I make essentially, I keep counting and make these groups of 10. So that's a 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, right? And then another 2, that's a 3, 6, 9, and 10, and a 2, that's 120. And then I come up with basically one loose pebble, right? So then what I can do is that I can still group things together, meaning that I have basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So that's essentially, that's another group of 10. So I can put them together. That's essentially 10 groups of 10, which is essentially 100, a group of 100. And here I have two groups of 10. So this is a 10 and this is a 10. So then what that means is that now I can, based on the information that I have, I can write down my number. So I have one group of 10, one group of 100. I have two groups of 10, and I have one group of 1, right? And I know that in my number system, in the decimal number system, this is the ones place value, this is the tens place value, and this over here is the hundreds place value, right? So anything essentially, the information that I have related to the hundreds place value, I have to put it over here, which is a 1. So I put a 1 over here. The information I have related to the tens place value, I put it in this column. So I have two groups of 10, so I put a 2 over here. And then I have one group of 1, so I put a 1 over here. And that means, and that way I know essentially how to write my number. And then I know that the number of pebbles is actually 121, which is essentially the number that we started with, right? So that's basically how we write our numbers. Now, based on, of course, I mean, with this system, you know that you can just keep going, meaning that we have essentially the ones place value, we have essentially the tens place value, or let me write it the other way around. So we know that essentially we are on the far right of the number, far right hand side of the number, we have the ones place value, then we have the tens place value, then we have the hundreds place. Each time essentially the value of the place value is multiplied by 100 by 10 as you move essentially from the right to the left, right? As you move from the right to the left, each place value, when you multiply it by a 10, you will get the value of the next place value. So essentially a 1 times a 10 is a 10. A 10 times a 10 would be 100. And again, 100 times a 10 would be 1,000. And then again, 1,000 times a 10 would be 10,000. And then again, 10,000 times a 10 would be essentially 100,000. And you can essentially keep going with the number. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then you can just simply keep going with this, right? So that's basically how you write your numbers in the decimal number system, which is the system that we use in mathematics and among humans. There is, of course, other number systems like the binary number system, the octal number system, the hexadecimal number system, and so on and so forth. But those things are usually used in computers because they are not easy for humans, so they are usually used in computers, in electronic circuitry. For example, the binary number system is used in computers. The octal number system for some applications, again in electronic circuits. The hexadecimal number system, again in some electronic circuits, and so on and so forth. So now, based on this, now we can move on to essentially, now that we know essentially about the place value and about how to write our numbers down, then now we can essentially use this information in order to do addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division on these numbers. I'll see you in the next video, and thank you.